folks, welcome back. I'm Heather and this is Recently Seen Reading. I thought I would do a December wrap-up of sorts as we are now hurtled into the new year. I'm not going to talk about everything I read because about half of what I read is connected to a research project I'm working on, and it's pretty dry library history stuff, and history of adult education, that kind of thing. But I did read a stack of other things that were either interesting or frustrating in interesting ways. But first, maybe an update on how my no buy, no borrow is going. So I'm doing a no buy, no borrow for December and January, partly to slow my roll a little bit, to slow down the number of books I was buying, because it had taken a tick up pretty dramatically. And it's an effect of being on BookTube. The more you're on BookTube, the more likely you are to increase the number of books you buy. The no buy portion of the no buy, no borrow has gone very well. I've bought nothing for myself, and I think I had actually finished all of my December gift purchases before the month began as well. The no borrow has gone well as well, although I twitch every time I look at the new books list coming in from the library. I started the month of December with about 40 books out from the library. It's a combination of the public library and the academic library I borrow from. And I've got that whittled down to about 28, so that's good progress. And I'm hoping to half that again by the end of January. So this is the shelf here, are the remains of the borrowed books. And I'd like to get that back down to about half a shelf. I can have as many books as I want from the library. I don't have enough shelf space for them all. And if I've had them on my shelf waiting for me to read for about a year, it suggests that the book's not particularly important to either my pleasure reading or my project reading. So it's time to either read them or return them. So I've divided my reading in December into, say, 3 piles. A pile I'm not going to talk about, the project-related reading. A pile of entertainments, stuff that's essentially light reading, genre fiction. And a pile of interesting books that would, in some cases, bear rereading in the way that genre fiction often doesn't bear rereading for me. So in terms of the entertainments, I read another one of Christopher Brookmyre's Jack Parlabane novels. I used to read these fairly regularly and fell out of the habit. I finished Black Widow, which is a fairly recent novel. These are pretty standard investigation, murder, mystery type of novels. They often have very unusual or comic elements in them that I think is Brookmyre's strength, is that somehow he takes mystery plots and can make them comic. This one wasn't particularly comic. Like all the other ones, it's set in Scotland. It's the story of the investigation of Diana Yeager and the death of her new husband, Peter. And it's a well-done mystery. I'm not going to talk much about it. Yeager is an interesting character. The novel has several playful turns at the end that if I talk about them, I'll ruin it for you. So it's a competent, well-done mystery. It makes me want to read a couple more Brookmyres in the future. I also did a little bit of reading outside of my usual genres for pleasure reading. I read C.J. Polk's Witchmark. This is a fairly recent novel. Polk is a Canadian writer. Science fiction or fantasy, probably falls into the fantasy bucket more neatly. So Witchmark takes the idea of World War I battle fatigue or trauma and recasts it into a fantasy world. So it uses that metaphor from World War I to write a story about power in families, power in communities, and follows the story of a doctor, his soon-to-be fairy lover, and his sister. So it merges kind of an echo of historical fiction with fantasy and science fiction into a romance plot. And it's fairly well done. There are parts of it where I thought the pacing was off. It takes a long time to get to some of the key elements of the plot, and probably not as much time spent on the political machinations than it needed. I think there's probably connected to just the challenges of world building. But it was good enough that it made me want to read Polk's next novel, which is coming out in the spring or the fall, I think. The most disappointing of the entertainments I read was Mary Kowal Robinette's The Calculating Stars. So this one has a really interesting premise. So it asks, what would it have been like if this space race happened in the middle 50s rather than in the 60s and 70s? And it looks at what the role of women might have been in that context if the women who worked as either calculators during the war, calculating bomber trajectories, or women who were in the WACs who flew planes in and out of battlefield areas but weren't actually in combat. What would it have been like if they had been involved in the space race? So it's a very interesting kind of premise. The problem with the novel is it's very cliche. It sticks so closely to a single character, and that single character's way of thinking is so cliched in many ways that it kind of undoes a lot of the interest that the premise has. I'm not likely to pick up the next novel in this series. It was ultimately a disappointing novel for me. So in addition to the entertainments, I also read a stack of novels, some of which would repay rereading, I think. I read Adam Foulds' Killer-nominated Dream Sequence, and this one deals with the intersecting lives of an actor and his stalker. So it's about characters who are very self-obsessed in some ways. And I found it oddly annoying novel, and I think that has more to do with how annoying I found the characters than the strength of the novel itself. All of the characters lead pretty self-absorbed, self-deluded lives, and there's some nice bits of satire of that way of going through the world, but I found it a very frustrating book to read. An easy read, but disappointing in some sense. But I think that's more that I wasn't in the mood for that kind of fiction than a problem with the quality of the writing itself. I think Foulds is a strong writer, though, and I'm going to put another of his novels on my reading list for this year or next. What else did I read? Let's see. I've been poking my way through the winners of the Women's Prize that I haven't read. So I've read about half of the Women's Prize winners, and I had intended to pick up Suzanne Berne's A Crime in the Neighborhood, but I grabbed the wrong book off the shelf in the library. I picked up A Perfect Arrangement. So I read it anyway, and this is a story of a couple and the woman they hire as a nanny, and it includes a fair amount of domestic satire, and it's a little bit thriller-like. It deals with kind of the claustrophobia inside the family and the increasing obsessiveness of the nanny, as well as some of the kind of marital problems that the couple hiring her have. So it stuck with me in a way that I wouldn't have expected it to. So I think I will see if I can pick up A Crime in the Neighborhood in the future. In the better late than never category, I finished up 2 books that were on my Gone with the Book reading list. The one I finished most recently was Aleta Day by Frances Marion Beynon. This was published in 1919 and is an autobiographical novel. This isn't a particularly strong novel, but it's been picked up and reprinted by 2 different publishing houses over the last 30 years or so. It was republished by Virago and then more recently by Broadview Press, which is a Canadian imprint. And if you read it, you'll get a sense that Beynon is working through stuff that was difficult in her life, stuff that was important to her, but it's a clunky novel. But it gets reprinted, I think, because of its topics it covers. It's a feminist novel. It looks at not so much the suffrage movement, although Beynon was very involved in the suffrage movement in Manitoba and was a peer of Nellie McClung and that crew. But it gets picked up because of the way it looks at the intersection of private lives and political activism. It deals with Aleta Day's pacifism and her active opposition to the First World War and her relationship over time with someone who's on the opposite side of that political spectrum, her involvement with someone who does become a soldier. So worth reading, maybe, if you're interested in Canadian literature or if you're interested in literature written by women who are interested in women's suffrage or politics of the day. The second one I finished for Gone with a Book I would recommend wholeheartedly. It's one of my favorite books of the year, in fact. It's Sylvia Townsend Warner's The Corner That Held Them, which she published in 1948. It's the story of a fen country convent over the course of the 15th century. It's a place where not much happens, and in the novel, I think Warner is playing with rewriting chronicles. So chronicles are a form of history telling that is, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and this happened. And convents are stereotypically places where nothing happened, and nothing happened, and nothing happened, and nothing happened. So Warner's working against that notion of a place without history, and creates this convent full of a cast of characters who come and go, but the characters themselves aren't the tight focus of the novel. It's the process of change, the motivations that cause change that interests Warner, I think, in this novel. It's very much about the way small lives in which very little seems to happen are connected to larger historical moments, the larger passage of time and conventional ways of seeing history. It's an unusual historical novel in that approach, and it's very sharply written. There's not a page that goes by when there's not a section where Warner's satiric eye comes out on the page. She can be a very stabby writer and a very funny writer, and I would heartily recommend this one, especially if you enjoyed, say, Samantha Harvey's The Western Wind and its experimental approach to history telling, or if you're reading Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall and are interested in that period of history, because I think Warner is experimental with the historical novel in a different way than Mantel is experimental with the historical novel. So lastly, I read Simone de Beauvoir's A Very Easy Death, an autobiographical piece about her mother's death, which she published in 1964. I've read bits and pieces of Beauvoir in the past, mostly excerpts from The Second Sex, so this is the first sustained piece of writing of hers that I've read. It's probably one of her shortest books. I've eyeballed some of her novels and I backed away because of their length. I'll probably fix that this year. It's a very stark book, and very matter-of-fact, very matter-of-fact about some of the kind of emotional horrors of watching your parent die, and very much about grief, but the way that the grief is expressed is pretty subdued for an account of the 3 months or less that Beauvoir and her sister spent with their mother who was dying. I think Beauvoir gets the combination of matter-of-factness and grief and horror quite right. The emotional states seemed very familiar to me. My mother died about 5-6 years ago, and a lot of the kinds of emotions and kinds of reaction that Beauvoir talks about, that moment of surprise and discomfort, and a moment that passes very quickly when you have to deal with a parent who's suddenly naked because you need to tend to them physically. I think she handles that really well. It seemed very familiar to me. So you can get the sense that there's a lot of unresolved stuff between Beauvoir and her mother, and a lot of horror at the callousness of the medical treatment that the mother receives. She's not actually told that she's dying or what she's dying of, and some of the surgeries make things much worse. So an odd little book, something I'll probably go back and reread. Not as emotionally difficult as I thought it would be. I tend still to avoid books about mothers dying because it's a difficult topic for me. I think that Beauvoir's account is a very collected and controlled account of death and grief. But in that control kind of reminded me of what it's like to be in that shell-shocked couple of weeks after a death. All of the matter-of-factness that has to go into that time, and the amount of control that has to go into that time once the intense surge of emotion has passed. This is a short little book, but well worth a read. I think I'll leave it there, folks. I had a great reading month, and I hope you did too, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.